Okay, well, let's get started. I think I'm hot. My mic is hot anyway. Hello, welcome back from lunch. I advice from Gary on how to get the crowd excited after lunch says that best way is to have everybody switch. But I'm not going to make you switch seats. He said it's a great way to get the crowd invigorated. You know, everybody switches seats, and then you look at that one person who decides they're not switching seats. You know that they're the outlier. Anyway, welcome to this breakout session. We are here today to talk about project review, which is a little bit stale, but I mean that is really the guts of what a project is about, and we always have a bit of a discussion before we get together. And the things that we talked about, my standpoint as a journalist, I can't really talk about project review until I start to talk about planning and start to initiate, how does the project come to be? So I hope we can kind of create a bit of a circle and go from project planning to review, but also talk about some of the most important things, one of which would be how to optimize on those projects. So we have two fantastic guests. First, we have Cherie Brandt. She is partner and national leader of Indigenous law with Gordon Bay. She practices across a wide variety of sectors, including energy transmission, land development, and financing. Probably a lot of people know. This is next we have Jason Schultz. Jason is Executive Director of Strategic Advisory Services with Chippewa Nation in Alberta. Among his other roles, Jason serves as Secretary for Three Nations Energy, organization where Athabasca Free for Chippewa and Métis Association partnered with ATCO Electric, for those who don't know, to establish Canada's first and largest off-grid solar farm. Welcome to Jason. Well, thank you. Let's jump right into it. I mean, I think every project starts with a plan. I know that. So let's start with the planning process. What are some of the best practices that your travels process goes well?
Sure. So thank you for having me first off. It's so nice to see all of you. This is a huge room for everybody that's online. Lots of excited people here. And so really pleased to be here and really happy to talk to you. I know that people talk about the planning process, but it often gets forgotten. I come at this topic as being originally a real estate lawyer, so I'm very focused on land and really just understanding the unique land jurisdictions that we have. I think one of the most critical things to think about as you're planning a project is really understanding what land you're dealing with. On the First Nation side, you could be looking to develop a project on Crown land. Maybe you're looking to develop a project within your own community. For other developers out there, you're looking to understand where is the project most able to be connected and to be developed. I think oftentimes and I'm going to speak from my background as a First Nation individual. I'm from the Mohawks of the Bay of Quinte on my dad's side and from Wikwemikong in Ontario on my mom's side. I got some fans here. But so, just thinking about it from the First Nation side, the biggest thing is that people just want to build a project. They just want to be a part of something special. They want to be a part of what's going to be a project that can enable the economy, that can really transform the community. And there's so much excitement around that I think, honestly, the planning piece gets forgotten. And people may not realize that, you may be dealing with Indian Act lands that are subject to Crown approvals. You may have an unwanted party in your transaction, which is the federal government, that isn't necessarily going to want to move your project along at the same speed as you. So my big takeaway is really to understand your project from a land perspective and really know, like, can this be developed? What are the different approvals that you're going to need? And it's not always to say that a project being developed on Indian Act lands doesn't have permits. We absolutely do. And as projects get more complicated and large, they're going to need just the same approvals that we would find in other federal government.
What about from your perspective, Jason, on the planning process? Obviously, you've been involved in a lot of different projects, some of them more complex. What are your takeaways on practices?
Well, one of the things you really have to learn, regardless of how much planning you have involved, you also have to be flexible. More often than not, things don't quite go according to plan. So we had the best plans laid out in terms of engagement, working with the provincial and federal government to our off-grid solar project in Fort Chipewyan, but it took a lot of time to get the community up to speed with engagement, work around some of the subcontracting. COVID hit, and all of a sudden, the people that were doing spirals decided to leave back up in the community, start work on our solar farm south of Calgary there. Would have thought that Alberta would tie in batteries. All kinds of hiccups, despite the best planning. You can have the engineers sign off, you can have the bankers sign off, you can have all the community. Everybody wants to leave a legacy, but being part of that legacy is more challenging.
They're particular, obviously they're the curveballs. Those are completely, but then there are just the regular obstacles, part of the planning process. Run into things like that, Sherry?
Yeah, so I think, for me, the projects that I've had the fortune to work on with our clients, it's really trying to understand what are the milestones that we have to hit. In the renewable energy space, often you're working in a space that maybe the project is looking to get a power purchase agreement. There's going to be very strict timelines. And you've got to work through consultation processes if the project is located off First Nations lands. And, so you can run into challenges in not necessarily knowing how to consult with the communities that may be impacted by projects. This is something that we're absolutely involved in. We help our clients navigate that space and sort of understand how to keep the project moving so that you meet the timelines. I think another thing to share is that some projects, what we often focus around is like, how is this project going to get financed? Is the project of the right size that could be project financed? Or is it of a certain size that it should really be financed by the nation itself through grants or other forms of accessing funds? And so, every project really just needs to be approached from like, what is this, what are we planning? What is achievable? Can I attract outside investment? Or do I want to make this a community project? We're in such a big room here, and I feel like everybody's doing all sorts of things in different sizes, maybe just starting out, maybe you're looking to finance a project. But, at a certain point in time, like the nation's going to have a bunch of incredible assets, and they're going to want to look at those assets and understand how they can be managed for the benefit of the nation and future generations. Some of the planning should be around trying to understand, should that be owned by a separate legal entity that can go out and get financing? So some of those planning aspects.
What about, just picking up on that, what about that idea of discussing at a very early stage how those benefits are meted out?
Well, it's a bit of a dance, one might think, sharing the benefits of projects or one project. It took a lot of planning, it took a lot of engagement, not only members but community. Those leaders come and go, ongoing communication, ongoing collaboration, reminding in the case of Fort Chipewyan, we wanted to reduce the consumption in the community, rely on a winter road to bring last summer when we saw power prices spike in Alberta. All of a sudden everyone power bill's too high. Blame the solar. Meant to bring stability to the grid, not offset the price of power in the community. Other planning, quite often, timelines, but timelines do often come and go. Thing our merchant solar Calgary with COVID, all of a sudden the price of steel was going through the roof, shipping was going through the roof, although we had some fixed contracts, others were willing to pay more, so all of a sudden the shippers didn't want to ship panels over. That caused delays. Then you had the port strike in Vancouver. That caused delays. It was one delay after another. So it's very important to remain flexible in your planning, but still focus on the end goal and to remind people, well, we have a timeline, we have obligations. Those that are providing financing, have obligations. Project partners to deliver on revenue, have obligations. Chippewa to reinvesting in capacity development, sending a little bit of a distribution back to the community, profits allowed. It's an ongoing process. It's an ongoing dance. Go forward at times, going forward. At times you have to backtrack.
Practically, what does that look like in terms of the consultation process that you're talking about? You've got together. I mean, part of the earlier segment was Big C consultation. Is it a mix of these two things? One of you?
So, on the consultation front, I think, as we're advising developers to do projects, we're always looking to identify what is the, as you say. I think within communities, as communities are developing projects, it just makes sense to be talking to your neighbors and making sure that people understand, what you're doing from a project development perspective. On the consultation front, I find that the big key is to really help identify who's the communities that may be impacted by projects. We sort of talk about a phase around early consultation, and that's focused around identifying who would be those communities that you need to reach out to based on land rights and interests. But the formal consultation will often begin when you get a letter from the ministry in connection with the project, and that's really when you really need to start creating a record and identifying how you're engaging with. And so that's the story on the developer side. On the nation side, they'll sort of be thinking about, they want to understand how to participate. How can we be involved? A lot of the communities have felt left out of projects for so many years. It wasn't never clear how the community was involved. But now, I think, fast forward, I've been doing this for so many years now. You fast forward, and there's a real interest to have Indigenous involvement projects. So I think communities look at the consultation requirements very differently than developers do. Hopefully those lines are blurring, and then we start to see everybody focus on really just trying to work together and seeing that the more Indigenous involvement we have in projects, the greater success those projects will have getting to it.
Yeah, I think that's a great point in terms of that flip happen. I think we talked about this previously around First Nations approaching business as opposed to business approaching First Nations. Talk a bit about how your projects work in that regard, Jason?
Yeah, sure. So in the case of the Athabasca Chippewa First Nation, most of our partnerships have been when industry or outside groups have approached us. I started with the Athabasca Chippewa First Nation in October of 2017. 2 or 3 months into my position, and ATCO approached us on the Three Nations Energy Project in Fort Chippewa. In parallel, I was already working on an energy plan, so it dovetailed really nicely into part of what became a longer, larger journey for the nation, both in terms of local projects, but seeking out partnerships for economic viability on a larger scale with a longer lifespan to diversify outside of what had traditionally been partnerships with the oil sands. Since then, we've engaged in a lot more, both renewable as well as some non-renewable. So we really do take a pragmatic balance of a lot of that. Quite often myself, I'm actively involved in these projects from the get-go, so that involves a lot of negotiations with industry, negotiations with government, negotiations amongst my peers to drive these projects forward to a successful outcome. We're all involved. Consultation with community members typically also occurs outside of your inner consortium committee or negotiating committee on projects, but it's a very involved process with multiple stakeholders. At the end of the day, everybody has to provide their endorsement forward. It's about establishing relationships, making everybody feel comfortable with the transaction, on information, because without that trust, without that comfort, it does become a bit of a challenging.
Go ahead.
I do want to add on that point. I mean, something to think about consultation itself. We sort of think about the big C consultation is really the minimum. It's really the minimum threshold. It's really the minimum bar as far as what's required, from a constitutional law standpoint. What we see now is that organizations, I sit on the board of Hydro One since 2018, and companies like that are saying, we understand the minimum threshold, but we actually want to focus on having stronger relationships with Indigenous communities. So we're not going to look to just meeting that threshold. We're going to look to go beyond it and establish a really groundbreaking. Hydro One actually made the step to identify that for all of their projects that would be over $100 million in investment, that they weren't going to go through the consultation process in its specificity, but rather they would go out and say, let's be partners on these projects. And they made the declaration to be 50-50 partners on all major transmission projects. That was with a very specific intent in mind to sort of fast track the process and allow the communities to come together and then say, okay, we're all going to be partners on this. Now let's focus on the other aspects, which would be other commercial contracts, other subcontracting, which I don't think there's enough attention. That's the next chapter.
Do you see similar thing? I mean, we're in different jurisdictions here. Obviously, Hydro One is not Alberta, but do you see similar things happening in Alberta?
Generally, that's the case. In the case of ACFN, when we were building our 3 solar plants south of Calgary, we actually asked the contractors that were bidding on the work, what is their stance around Indigenous employment? So when we were building the solar farms, we had over 50% Indigenous involvement from the Blood Tribe to build these solar farms. Fast forward a little bit, we've also established capacity development reciprocity agreements with the Blood Tribe to try and get them a little more advanced in terms of their understanding of renewables and getting youth involved. And we also reciprocate that in Fort Chipewyan with the Energy Project. 20% of the revenue earned from the projects goes back to capacity development around renewable energy, carbon reduction, among other things.
So capacity development is a pretty interesting topic in and of itself. I mean, is that something that dealt with on, you're saying that's built into the agreement?
That's built into the agreements or an expectation. In the case of the Coaldale, Vulcan, and Monarch projects, it wasn't mandated. It was a nice to have. So although it wasn't mandated, we still achieved a very successful outcome on that. In the case of the Fort Chipewyan projects, we wanted to preserve jobs in the community. So we did involve the communities in terms of hiring local members. We did hire a local subcontractor initially. Despite our best intentions, some of the employment obligations didn't quite pan out as expected, and the local contractor that we subcontracted subcontracted out the work to somebody outside the community. Everybody still benefits to a certain extent, but
you want to weigh in on the capacity issue as well, please?
You know what I would say for us, if we're engaged to assist on a project, we will work with the developer and talk with them about the importance of establishing some early agreements, right? People talk about a memorandum of understanding. They use the term capacity building agreement. Whatever it is, it's that early stage agreement that starts to form the relationship between the First Nation, the Indigenous community, and that proponent. And those formal agreements are absolutely critical. They document the relationship. They start the working together, going at the same time. And, they're also really important as you get back to fulfilling your permitting and obligations on trying to get your project developed. You want to make sure that you can always go back and refer to those MOUs, those capacity funding agreements, and make sure that those are in place. So it's, for us, it's like just trying to ensure that the developer has that assistance along the way. And, I think because we worked with so many First Nations.
That's great advice. Do you have any advice? A lot of these things. Capacity.
Yeah, we took a little bit of an atypical approach at the community level in Fort Chipewyan, although we have many of the MOUs and focus on capacity development. We also looked at making things possible at home. So we started a community cycling program. Kelvin Walkwin was actually very involved in that as part of the community initiative. We started some remote cabin off-grid solar packages, so members wouldn't have to transport out to their cabins, etc. So a lot of these smaller projects that build on the momentum of the larger projects, I think we saw considerable wins in the community as well. We also established some greenhouses and local gardening projects just to try and minimize the carbon footprint of bringing in, for example, a head of lettuce from California to Edmonton and into the community of Fort Chipewyan, with our community being a very isolated community. In the summer, it's only accessible by air or water, and then we have maybe a 2 or 3 month window in the winter where we can bring goods up on the winter road, but those are also regulated by load limits on the winter roads, so you can't actually bring semis up there until probably late January, mid-February, depending on weather patterns, and you've got a 2, maybe 3 week window to get your heavier goods into the community. So a lot of that self-sustainability at home really is important beyond your MOUs, beyond your governing documentation on the larger projects.
And once a project has been built, you've gone through the planning process, checked all the boxes, you made all the agreements happen. How do you make sure that all of this gets delivered? I mean, it's a gargantuan task to get it all started and build capacity and do all these things at the same time. And then suddenly you're producing power, and then what happens?
Well, keeping it going is just as challenging, if not more challenging, than getting it built. You need ongoing partnership meetings, you need ongoing community meetings, ongoing maintenance. In the case of the solar farm in Fort Chipewyan, we have ATCO as operator doing the maintenance on the solar panels, etc., which is great. But at the same time, we're still trying to develop that local capacity, and we're constantly doing workshops where ATCO comes to the community and maybe talks about career opportunities for youth in the community around green energy, or if it's not green energy, it's other opportunities in trades and technology related to energy transmission, local grids, so on and so forth. We send youth to various conferences around capacity development. We reinvest a lot of money from the projects into other priorities such as energy efficiency in homes, developing skills at home for people to build housing, reinvesting in education, and some of that education is in engineering, trades, things that are related to energy efficiency, green energy, among other priorities.
Yeah, education is such an important part of this. I mean, and I think we just wrote a story in the Globe and Mail a few weeks ago about how there's a couple of legal scholars that are starting to write a new book about how some of these agreements come together from an Indigenous law perspective, from an environmental law perspective, things can get very complicated very quickly. But do you see, Sherry, on your end, do you see education helping push people towards those kind of roles beyond, say, like green energy roles, but into things like law and
So, I mean, I see all sorts of people interested in the energy space, to be honest. I think it's just where I'm exposed to.
Right.
So that's where my focus and interest is in. I wanted to go back to something that you mentioned around capacity. I think, we often think about building capacity at the beginning of the project, but it's really important to not forget how much capacity is achieved once you get to the end of the project. I've been involved in certain projects that where the First Nation had never borrowed money ever. This was like the very first time they ever had to finance a project, was to finance a small wind power project that we worked on. And you've got a council, you've got a whole bunch of people around the room. They've never borrowed because the way the Indian Act is set up, you can't borrow funds. You can't get a mortgage on Indian Act lands. The amount of capacity that gets created through going through that process is incredible, right? I feel like most of the communities that I've worked with have springboarded and have been like, okay, we did it. Oh my God, this is amazing. Now what's next? What do we want to do next? Let's build a grocery store. Let's do another energy project. Let's find a way to, be a part of the grid and help other industrial customers. So I think, that piece around capacity is so important that, just getting to the finish line, it's the end of the lawyer's job, but to me, that's like part of the most exciting part, because you guys out there who are developing these projects have actually achieved, it's a moment in time for you. I'm just so happy I get to be a part of a little bit of it. And if I can be a part of that early planning stage and help you avoid some of the pitfalls along the way, that's absolutely where we want to assist. On the education front, I mean, I don't know. I want to see more Indigenous people, pursuing careers like mine, of course.
What about you, Jason? What do you think?
Yeah, well, no, absolutely. I think capacity development is an ongoing skill in and of itself. As new technology and new best practices come to the forefront, we need our youth champions to move those forward and grow them to a scale where they are self-sustaining. It's a never-ending journey with the ability for continuous improvement. We need to challenge ourselves. There's always new ways of thinking, new ways of seeing things. Going back to Cherie's earlier example, I mean, our 3 solar farms south of Calgary, they're the first ones we invested our own money into. Other projects we've been involved in have been backstopped by provincial loan guarantees or partnerships with Ontario Power Generation Pension Plan, for example. Further to the solar farms that we built, which are 68 megawatts combined, we've added BESS to that. So once again, new practice, or relatively new. We're the 3rd player in the province of Alberta doing that. TD Asset Management was first, TransAlta is second, and now the Athabasca Chippewa is number 3 in the province.
There we go. Well, we've got a lot of people here, a lot of interesting people. We want to hear a little bit about your story. I mean, it could be a story, it could be a question, but we've got 2 fantastic panelists here. Does anybody have a question? We finally have all the mics working as well, so there's that benefit. You can hear us all. Does anybody have a question? We don't have mics for questioners, but we're in a small enough room that I think if you have a question, just shout it out. Go ahead.
It's not really a question,
Yeah.
but with respect to, so I'm going to use an example from an environmental remediation company that was trying to recruit me and this other lady. So they wanted to submit their bid for this multi-million-dollar remediation project. And they wanted to use my name and my resume in their submission. I'm like, wow, this sounds great. So we had a meeting with them, and when it came down to how much of my time over 2 years, several $1 million that you're going to get, how much of my time are you willing to allow me to participate and provide my own knowledge and expertise to this project?
Hmm.
Well, their response was, well, we need you 2 days here, 5 days here, and maybe 1 week towards the end. And so then the question came about, okay, well, you're going to use me to win a bid, and you're going to pay me this much, and you're going to end up with this much. There's something fundamentally wrong with this. When it comes to capacity building, an Indigenous person cannot properly be exposed and build capacity with little stints here and there over a 2.5-year project. And so I ended up like shutting that conversation down real quick. And same with the other lady. And then I start hearing about this IPP that the federal government is now imposing, well, not kind of imposing, they're not saying you have to. It's an option, but it's 30% of the points. So what I've seen in the Northwest Territories is I come from the richest region, the Cajun region, yet we're the poorest. And the capacity has never been developed. So when I'm trying to hire an engagement specialist for communications engagement, I have a hard time. If I'm trying to find somebody in policy and communications, at one point when I was working for the government of Northwest Territories, out of 58 positions across the entire GNWT, I was the only Indigenous person right across the board. And yet policy is essentially government.
Right.
And if our people are not part of that policy development, then we're not coming to the table on equal ground. And we will never have a leg up so long as that type of approach to how people are working with Indigenous people in governments, we will never build capacity so long as things are approached that way. And so I'm a strong advocate for Indigenous inclusion, also a strong advocate for Indigenous capacity building. But when companies are coming to the table and not willing to have meaningful Indigenous inclusion, because I'm a strong believer, exposure. I've been exposed to lots of different environments and tables. I've learned lots. So I think exposure, just creative exposure for Indigenous people and the opportunities there, I think is essential. And I think is in that initial strategic planning phase, I think there needs to be a lot more creativity in terms of where Indigenous capacity can be built. Because not all of us want to be laborers or housekeepers or cooks.
Right.
So I think in that initial planning stage, there needs to be a little more creativity in terms of how many Indigenous people can we have, even if they're just sitting there and learning, can be at the table as part of that Indigenous capacity building.
That's great. I mean, thank you for sharing. I mean, this is the advice portion of the program. Any advice on that capacity building question?
So I would just quickly jump in and say, you know what you're talking about is like the quintessential outcome that we are all looking for, right? And it's not an easy question, not an easy solution. I think, when I originally started doing work in this space, the whole goal was let's have the nations partner with industry on projects and then have the communities themselves go out and identify who would be all the individuals that could be involved and how would that capacity building happen. I think, we looked at it on the basis of how can we get access to capital or net revenues back to those communities so that they could then focus on other programming that mattered to their community members based on their needs, right? So not everybody's going to be a trader, as you say. Very difficult question to solve, like solely on the legal basis. And so you know, I work as a lawyer. It's not easy to address these issues, but I care about it deeply. I think the big question is, you know, in my mind, where things are switching for me is, you know, I always thought we had to partner with the nations directly. My mind is changing now, and I'm like, you know what, we need to find those companies that have been out there doing this work already in the space that have something meaningful to offer the other businesses, right? Like, you shouldn't be partnering with a company because you are Indigenous, right? You should be partnering with a company because you have experience in the space and you can actually be a meaningful partner. So like there's a lot of layers to peel off with what you're talking about, but I think it's such an important topic right now. You know, what I would say to people is that every community has its entrepreneurs. They're out there. We just don't see them. You have to get into the community and find them, and they can actually be really good partners to the businesses that, you know, to the transmission development, to the electricity development, to the you know, other projects in the energy space. Those contractors are there. Those are the companies that people should, like, they need to come out of the woodwork and be partnered with proponents to achieve those outcomes. Because governments are going to continue to ask about, I think when you said IPP, you meant Indigenous participation plans. So I would tell you from a policy perspective, as an Indigenous lawyer, we would absolutely push for that. Because we want to see the envelope pushed. We want people going out to try to uncover these companies, find these entrepreneurs who exist. So I think those policies are good. It's just, you know, beware of what you do, right? Like, don't don't partner in some area where you don't think you can contribute, or make sure that you have a meaningful role, right? I think when we advise communities on joint ventures, for example, we always want to ask the question, what is the nation going to provide in this relationship? Is it meaningful? Is it actual services, right? We're going to do that due diligence, because the worst thing that can happen is you have a relationship put together on a joint venture and then it falls apart because there wasn't actually businesses and services being provided. I think my partner here, Jason, could talk about that too.
Well, I was going to say, what you're saying is very accurate, but it takes time to develop those relationships and move the needles. Some First Nations are more advanced at business partnerships, business development, and so on and so forth. As a result of that, they start to get more recognition and develop more capacity and come to the forefront of future business transactions as a result of that. Every community, I agree, they have their entrepreneurs, but not all entrepreneurs are equal. You need to find those companies and those individuals that are a good match or a good fit, because otherwise neither party is living up to the expectations of that relationship. If you have a policy can dictate things, but if it's not a partnership that's meant to be, the larger relationship just falls apart. For those that like to get out there and hustle, you can find the next company that wants to be a partner. True, in the current environment, some are better at it or more advanced, but that doesn't stop individual nations from approaching industry, and likewise it doesn't stop industry from approaching First Nations. By us venturing into southern Alberta, that's outside of our traditional territory. We're a small community, an isolated one in northeastern Alberta, but here we are with 68 megawatts of merchant solar with Concord Pacific and another 45 megawatts of BESS. We're equal owners in both projects, so it takes time to establish those relationships and advance the capacity of individuals within those communities to steward those conversations, not only now but also in the future. And it's continuous improvement, not just on one party's side or the other. It takes two parties to have a partnership, right, and a meaningful one.
I just have one follow-up to that, and that is, so it's not just necessarily just for partnership. I think it would be really great for some of these companies to already make that Indigenous inclusion component already from the people within the space in the area that they're wanting to do and get these contracts for. I think that part makes it a lot more meaningful rather than going to somebody to try to create that in a not so sincere way, I guess. And I think that's where like the whole trust thing comes into play.
And humanity's always going to look for the quick solution, right? But that may not be the right one,
Yeah.
for sure.
Yeah, it takes time and it has to be a true relationship. Maybe partnership is not the right term.
Yeah.
It's such a fundamental question to what we're talking about, making sure you look for the best, I'll say partner, but, and beware the hustlers. So, I mean, I'm glad we got there. Thank you so much for that. Over here.
Yeah. My name is Gina Gazungi Simon. I'm from the Kumakan, proud to share it here. I currently work with Wishkam First Nations as a community energy champion. And I just want to build on what this woman was just speaking about too. Because we all know what's happened, you know, in our country, what's happening, and how the department has created so many definitions of First Nations people in this country, where a Métis person can just claim to be Métis, and we as First Nations people, the original people of the land, have to make an application and therefore be accepted by the 27 definitions in this country. So now we take it to the business level and people trying to make business with us and create a business partnership, incorporating IPP and other such things. Like, in all fairness, when we talk about capacity building, where do we draw an even line of balance where women like myself and others can truly be the leaders with these companies and these corporations and sit at these boardroom tables when other people are coming along? As soon as there's money there, all of a sudden they want to be an Indian. They claim that, and they can walk in the door and say, I represent First Nations. The government has fractured us so much and has made so much division, and it's so hard. And it's so hard for companies to even find legitimate First Nations people in this country to work with that are a true voice for the heart and soul of our people, and not just there at the table for the money.
Thank you for that. I think that's not a bad note to end on. I would like to, I always like to end on a positive note. I think that's a good one. I do want to ask the panelists just for, one thought on what makes them think the future is bright in this space. And maybe I can start with you, Jason.
Well, I think the fact there's ongoing challenges and problems yet to be solved, I think that's what makes it worthwhile. Mm-hmm. We have to keep pushing for better, doing better as new opportunities emerge. I just think there's an ability to capitalize on them. And when I say capitalize, not just from a monetary standpoint, making society better, making communities better, just reinvesting a lot of those gains back into various priorities. It's an ongoing journey. It's important to work with people that are credible and not just here for the short term, as we've talked about. I've worked with Green Planet Energy for almost 7 years since I've started with ATCO. They've been really great to work with in advancing a lot of these green energy technologies, but we're just starting. It's such a short journey in terms of the longer journey ahead. Take baby steps one day at a time, but enjoy the small wins because they're not always easy.
What about you, Cherie? What makes you optimistic for the future?
Well, I'm naturally very positive, so absolutely optimistic for the future. You know, what I'm focused on is I really want to see our Indigenous communities working together more. I think that as we partner together as nations, and maybe, we partner on our treaty lines, maybe we partner on our regional affiliations or otherwise, we are so much stronger together. And, I've had the opportunity of working on some major projects where multiple First Nations are coming together to be a part and own an interest in some existing assets, some new assets. And I think that's really part of the future. And for me, it's really exciting because, I sort of grew up in an age where communities weren't so nice to each other. I have a lot of that. I grew up with that, and, we just sort of had our ways of not necessarily supporting each other enough. So I'm excited for the future where we actually support each other as nations, where we bring money together. Maybe we're going to do an investment fund. Maybe we're going to enable investments in other major projects by way of nations coming together and pooling their funds. There's going to be so many complicated financings that are going to need to happen over the next 10 years. I mean, obviously I'm excited for those, but that's going to require a ton of collaboration, and it's just really strength in numbers for me. If communities come together, we're going to have a lot of good deals to talk about.
Thank you both for an amazing discussion. I mean, this is the beginning, obviously. There's lots of time to discuss other things. I have no idea if we're on time or overtime. Or,
late.
I mean,
There's still time on the
talks about
clock.
his watch at the beginning of the day, but we'll catch up, and there's lots more to absorb throughout the course of the day. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.